Welcome to Turn Round Australia. Some years ago, the producer-director of this program, Martin Johnson, and myself led a team of people to film a very interesting piece of Australian history where it happened. We were on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the western coast of Turkey. It was the first time an Australian film crew had captured the trenches and what happened there in 1915 since CFW Bean went there in 1923. Today I want to repeat to you what we filmed on that cold morning in Anzac Cove. As I walked around among the gravestones, as I went through the trenches where young Australian men and British men and Turkish men died for their faith, and thought here 500,000 people in this rugged little piece of landscape were wounded or died for their homeland or their beliefs, it occurred to me that everything I had heard as a child in Anzac dawn services had a special meaning. In our history, Anzac has a unique place. Would you come with us now as we travel to Gallipoli, to Anzac Cove, and remember what happened in what I've called simply our magnificent defeat. At 4:30 on an April morning in 1915, 16,000 Australian and New Zealand troops were towed in barges towards the coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. They were under orders to secure a beachhead and then attack the Ottoman army outposts on top of the ridge. But on landing, they discovered there was no beach, just steep cliffs. The plan to launch an assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula was well known to the Ottoman army. The problem was they didn't know where and when. The British commander, General Ian Hamilton, had planned a multi-pronged attack on the peninsula. He planned for the Anzacs to land on the western side of the peninsula, while the British made their landing further up the coast. Then the two armies would join forces, sweeping all the way to Istanbul, where they've joined forces with the Russians, having defeated the Ottomans. This would never happen. As the barges drew close to shore that morning, the men jumped into the water and struggled to the beach. They were weighed down by their kit and heavy coat. The water was deeper than they expected, and some drowned. Expecting an invasion, the Ottoman soldiers were on constant lookout. The first sign of the landing was when one of their sentries saw flame and sparks from one of the small steamboats towing 3 landing barges. Looking down at the beach, the soldier saw 36 rowboats just offshore. He shouted to his company, who opened fire. Instantly, the beach and water was under a constant hail of machine gun fire. This is the northern shore of the Dardanelles, the strait that provides the entrance from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. In 1914, in August, war was declared between Britain, Germany, France, and Russia. Into the war came Turkey. Turkey sided with Germany by attacking southern Russia. The Allies determined that they would take the pressure off Britain fighting Germany by getting an attack upon Turkey. So it was the Commonwealth forces were called on the 25th of April 1915. 16,000 men landed on this beach, known forever in Australian history as Anzac Cove. the 25th of April, 16,600 Allied troops landed here. By nightfall, 600 of them were dead, 2,000 of them were wounded. Today, nothing remains except the skeleton of this old landing barge. Over the next months, thousands more were to land here under the withering machine gun fire of the Turkish troops in the cliffs. Thousands were to die, and their bodies would rot under the fierce summer sun, bringing millions of flies with disease and dysentery. And then summer turned into a freezing winter, and it was decided to evacuate. Between the 26th of December and the 31st New Year's Eve, in one of those miracles of the war, 90,000 troops were evacuated without the loss of one life. The 9 months of Anzac had ended. The history of the land of Turkey goes back thousands of years. Some of the earliest inhabitants were the Hittites, an Indo-European race that arrived in Anatolia, the central and western part of Turkey that includes the Gallipoli Peninsula. They came in 2000 BC. By 1600, they had established a widespread empire. Anatolia is a land bridge between east and west, north and south, part of the triangle linking Africa, Europe and Asia. As such, it has influenced the history of the whole country as thousands of different people have passed through and settled here over the centuries. Apart from the Hittites, Anatolia has been home to the Phrygians, the Persians, the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and the Romans. In 330 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople, where it remained the centre of the Byzantine Empire until 1453, when it was captured by Sultan Mehmed II. The Ottoman Empire, named after Osman I, gradually came into power in the east, until in 1520 it ruled most of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. When war broke out in August 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany, Austria and Hungary in opposing Britain, France and Russia. The Gallipoli Peninsula is in the western or European part of Turkey. For centuries, the Dardanelles, the straits that separate east and west, Asia and Europe, have been seen as the way through which Turkey could be invaded and conquered. Britain had decided to attack the Dardanelles because she thought her soldiers could easily make their way to the capital Constantinople, or Istanbul as it is known today, and bring the Turkish-German alliance to an end, and so bring Germany to its knees. The Allies opened their attack in February 1915 with the Queen Elizabeth, the largest battleship in the world. their initial success was short-lived as the Ottoman Empire brought in reinforcements. On March 18th that year, a full-scale attack by the British ended in disaster as shore artillery and mines sunk a third of the fleet, with the rest fleeing in retreat. That date, March the 18th, was a great day of victory for the Turks, and is to the Turks what April 25th is to the Anzacs. Although the British were forced to retreat, they still believed that the way to defeat the enemy was to fight their way to Constantinople after landing here on the Gallipoli Peninsula. As the Anzacs fought from their hastily dug trenches, a continuous offshore barrage was kept up from the Queen Elizabeth and the other huge battleships, firing every kind of shell, 15-inch shells containing shrapnel, 6-inch, 12-inch and 12-pounders. The hills looked as if they'd been transformed into a smoking volcano, with each shell throwing up great chunks of ground and masses of black smoke. For the Anzacs, the enemy wasn't the only problem they faced. They had landed on a rocky beach, on a barren peninsula. The nearest Australian supply line was 500 miles away. Everything they needed, from guns and ammunition to medical stores and telephone cable, had to be unloaded from supply ships. Then there was the problem of flies. As the spring sun turned into summer, the conditions in the trenches were almost unbearable. The flies were in plague proportions, producing an epidemic of dysentery among the Allied troops. Eating became a constant battle between the flies and the soldiers. Some of the greatest heroes at Gallipoli were the medical orderlies and stretcher bearers. They didn't carry arms, just water bottles and big field dressings for shrapnel wounds. They couldn't manage anymore by the time they were carrying a wounded soldier on a stretcher. On their backs, they had strapped bundles of kindling wood from broken cases so they could boil a billy near the front line. The shoreline around Anzac Cove and the other beaches soon took on the appearance of a quartermaster's store as supplies were piled up on the beach or dug into the side of the steep cliffs. But even down here, the soldiers weren't out of reach of the Ottoman snipers. The sun was hot, and whilst the Anzacs could cool off in the sea, they were short of drinking water. Up on the cliffs, Johnny Turk had plenty of drinking water, but could only look in envy at the cool sea. Even though the Allies had the sea as a supply channel, there was still a shortage of vital equipment, including ammunition. The Ottoman army had similar problems, so much so that the Turkish soldiers were forbidden to shoot at the enemy when they saw him taking a swim or exercising his horse. The plan to storm the Dardanelles was the idea of Winston Churchill, who was first Sea Lord. It was a bold, imaginative, daring plan, and impossible. Winston would have to wait to other battles in another war before he had victory. There were two sides in this war, and both of them lost. The Turks lost heavily. 90,000 dead, 300,000 wounded. And the Australians dug in trenches like rabbits. "22,000 Australians holed up in these trenches. Wave after wave went over the top to be cut down by machine gun and rifle fire. They were left there unburied. To attempt to bury them was to join them. For 4 months they stayed in these trenches. Then a decision was made to reach the top of a ridge where one lone pine stood. From the 6th of August, in the next 4 days, another 2,000 would be dead. And the result? The Allies won about 1 kilometre of beach. The Turks lost 90,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. The British lost 19,500 dead and 50,000 wounded. The Anzacs lost 10,500 dead and another 22,000 wounded. We'd gained 8.5 months of war and a kilometre of deserted beach. And the irony is that Turkey became Australia's ally. But a legend was born, the Anzac legend. The Anzac legend was born in the trenches and in the bunkers here at Anzac Cove, but it was alive already at home, and within the 8.5 months of action here, already at home 70,000 new young men had enlisted for the fighting. And there was more fighting to come. We were to fight against the Turks in Mesopotamia and Palestine, and then there was France, Flanders, the Somme and Ponziers. Especially Ponziers. More Australians fell per square mile in Ponziers than here at Anzac Cove. And the British generals were alive to the Anzac legend. They had found an inexhaustible supply of fit, athletic, courageous young men who would be, with the Maoris and with the Indian Gurkhas, utterly dispensable in the defence of the empire. But where did they come from, these dispensable men who headed for the great adventure of World War I? They came from every Australian community, country, town and farm. The cry went round that young men were needed by God, King and Empire. They didn't understand the meaning of the war, except that they were needed to go and fight as their fathers had gone before. Theirs was not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Long marches were started from country towns, and as they went from town to town, more and more young men suddenly left the horse and plough, their jobs as jackaroos and the shearing sheds. They joined the march to the cities, where they were cheerfully kitted out and then deployed on steamers that took them to the biggest adventure of their lives. 1 in every 80 men in Australia at the time joined up and headed off for the shores of France and Egypt and Turkey. They were farewelled by mothers and wives and sweethearts. None of them really knew what the war was, let alone what horrors that first Anzac Day would bring. In the summer of 1914, tens of thousands of young Australians answered the call to enlist, a call from the United Kingdom to come over and help God and King and Empire. And they came here to Gallipoli. Thousands of them landed just down in Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915. Thousands of them died that day and in the days that were to lie ahead. In fact, 10,000 young Australians lie buried on this small strip of beach known as Anzac Cove, and several hundred names are remembered here in the cemetery called Lone Pine. After 6 months of fighting and the changing of the seasons from summer to winter, the troops woke on November the 28th to find the area covered in snow. The problems of summer heat were replaced with freezing winds and frozen trenches. The Allied commanders decided that the time had come to evacuate. On a morning in late December 1915, the Ottoman army noticed the Australian trenches were unusually quiet. Carefully, they sent out soldiers to try to discover the reason. As they approached the trenches, wary of a trick, they discovered that they were empty. The Anzacs had left. Many had left behind food and gifts as tokens of friendship, because although they saw the Ottoman army as the enemy, they had gotten to know and respect Johnny Turk. Like many of them, he too was away from his family and loved ones. During the 6 months, there had been moments of ceasefire when both sides agreed that those that were lying dead and rotting in no man's land should be buried. As burial parties from each side crisscrossed the ridges, picking up the dead on litters and donkeys, they stopped and exchanged cigarettes and souvenirs. Each side found new respect for the other. Such are the contradictions of war. What does it mean, 70 years later, as we come back to this bleak and windswept Anzac Cove at Gallipoli? For some, it meant the foundation of the Australian nation. For the first time, the Australian people were welded together into one following federation. For some, it was the start of the new legend, the Anzac legend, which was going to be kept alive with phrases like digger and mate and Aussie and fair dinkum, wherever Australians were to meet. And for others, it was the start of a new kind of a secular religion, which would meet once a year with its own shrines of marble and stained glass called cenotaph and shrine of remembrance, where there would be strange pre-dawn rites of the last post, of the trumpet sound, of wreath laying, of speeches about sacrifice. There are some things that we can gather together. There was no question, Anzac drew Australia together as a people. We were drawn together from the little townships of our land. And there did develop a sense of mateship, of comradeship that Australians still feel wherever they meet around the world. And there did grow up a folklore, a legend of heroes, of ordinary people, like John Simpson Kirkpatrick, who found a little donkey and, separated from his field ambulance, went up and down for 1 month these hills, taking the wounded back until he too was shot. Simpson and his donkey forgot himself into immortality. And finally, we must never forget that crouched here in these trenches were the contorted flesh of young Australian manhood. A whole generation of them who lie forever in the sands of Turkey. We remember the words of Jesus. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. They shall not grow old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Anzac Cove has a powerful place in the history of all who would call themselves Australian. And so it is true that we as people should have a right relationship with God, that we can understand better our own history and the values for which those young men died. If you would like to talk to one of our counsellors about any of this, give them a ring right now, wherever you are in Australia, on 02 267 5555. That's 02 267 5555. Next Sunday we'll return to our normal programs of Turn Round Australia, and I will see you same time next week. Goodbye for now.